Hello everybody and welcome to video 3 of 3 from this series on the Canon Eos T6i. In the first video we looked at everything was, in the second video we talked about how to use everything to take photos. In this video we're going to cover everything in the menus, which you access by hitting the menu button right there. Now, the menus have a few different ways you can navigate them. They are touchscreen, so you can scroll through them like that. You can touch specific items. To prevent the screen from getting all messed up as I do this video, I'm just going to be navigating with the cross pad here, which we can use to get through the screens as well. Let's orient ourselves with what these different screens are. You'll notice here that this tab is red, and as I scroll down through here, these bars are red. The red tabs are the shooting menus. Blue are for playback, yellow are for setup, and green is for my menu. Also, you'll see here there's a 1, 2, 3, and now 1 dot here. So if I talk about shooting 1, that's this one. This would be shooting 3, this would be live view shooting 1, and for instance, these would be settings 1 through 4, okay? So that's how we're going to navigate this. If there is a specific screen that you have a setting that you need information about, look in the video's description for a time-linked index to shooting menus 1, 2, and 3, live view shooting 1, or live view shooting, playback 1 and 2, settings 1 through 4, my menu, and then custom functions. There's a custom function setting under one of the settings menus here. We're going to do all of those on their own at the very end. So let's start off here in shooting menu 1 with image quality. RAW is raw images. That's what's going to be saved when you take a photo. RAW plus L means RAW plus JPEG. It will save a RAW photo plus a JPEG. Small 3, small 2, small 1. And you can see, by the way, up here, the size of the images as well as how many the SD card that's in the camera can hold up each size. Medium coarse, medium fine, large coarse, large fine, and then back to raw. So you can see the difference, by the way, between large fine, which is the full 24 megapixels at 36,400 JPEGs, versus raw at less than a third of that, at about 25% of that. So significantly more information in the raw files, which means there's a lot more editing flexibility as well. If you're using any modern version of Windows, which is anything newer than about 7 years ago, the raw files will, and I believe this is also true for Mac, the raw files will display with image previews in your Windows folders on your computer. So doing raw plus JPEG doesn't really do anything for you. It just cuts a couple hundred files out of what you can store on your SD card. Just shoot raw. If you're going to be doing editing on your computer, there's no reason to shoot raw plus JPEG anymore. Beep is simply enabled, disabled, or touch to mute. Basically, this is whether or not you want your camera to beep when different functions happen. Release shutter without card, enable, or disable. If you disable releasing the shutter without the card, the camera will not take a picture if you have no card in it. And that's a good way when you turn on your camera just to check at a glance whether or not there's a card in the camera. Image review, off, 2, 4, 8 seconds, and hold. This is image review is the image popping up on the screen after you take it. So off means it won't. This is how many seconds it will. And hold means it will hold until you dismiss it, which I think is done with the set button. I tend not to use image review because not using image review, it's like a crutch. It makes you reliant on image review to make sure that your photo turned out well. If you just turn it off, you're going to have to learn to trust yourself to take good photos first. And if you make mistakes, which you will not get a second chance at them. It's a tough lesson not to get a second chance at a photo, so you can always go and hit the playback menu to check a photo if it's very critical and you really want to make sure you nailed it. Also, turning off image review does prolong the life of your battery. Lens aberration correction. These are 3 different types of aberrations that the camera can correct based on data that the lens gives it. Peripheral illumination, chromatic aberration, and distortion. Peripheral illumination is light loss. With every lens, the center of the lens is brighter and then the corners are dimmer. Not with what you're looking at right now because of the way my lighting is set up, but trust me on this. With this enabled, it would correct for that light loss and make your images more flat. However, that would also introduce a little bit of digital noise into the peripheries of your image. Chromatic aberration at places where there's high contrast, say a boundary between very white and very black right here, there could be something called purple fringing, green or blue fringing, where the contrast reveals places where out-of-focus light is not quite as well focused. And chromatic aberration occurs there, and for a few other reasons. But enabling that would help to cut that out. Distortion, all lenses distort. If you have a straight line on the edge of your image over here, it could be bowed out a little bit or bowed in. If the straight line bows out, that's called barrel distortion. If it bows in, and those lines I'm tracing are very distorted, by the way, that's called pincushion distortion. This distortion correction uses algorithms in the camera to eliminate that distortion. However, it also takes that out of your control, which means that if there's anything weird that happens on the image peripheries because of that, you're going to be stuck with it. So generally speaking, I recommend disabling all of these, because if you're doing any kind of photo editing on your computer, all of these can be controlled very well with any modern photo editing software. Red eye reduction, enable or disable. This will trigger your autofocus assist light to flash prior to the flash being fired to reduce the size of people's pupils to eliminate red eye. This is a matter of personal preference and really only applies if you're going to be using a flash directly on top of your camera pointed at your subjects or your pop-up flash. If you're going to use some of the improved flash technique that we talked about in the second video, this doesn't matter at all. Flash control. This is a very complex menu, but flash firing will enable or disable you from being able to fire a flash with your camera. ETTL meter. This is the way that your flash will meter the scene prior to firing, evaluative or average. Honestly, I can't really tell you what the difference is going to be in the results between these, with the possible exception that average will be slightly more prone to flash-related hotspots if there are reflective subjects in your scene, whereas evaluative in that setting might be a little bit better. So for 99.9% of flash uses, that's 6 one way, half dozen the other. Flash sync speed in aperture priority mode only applies to aperture priority mode. Do you want it to be only 1/200th of a second, 1/60th to 1/200th of a second, or 1/200th of a second and anything slower? This is basically what kind of flash automatic shutter speed control you want your camera to have in aperture priority mode. So automatic can lead to some surprises if you are in that, and you might get a 1 second exposure even though you fired the flash. This will limit your flash exposure shutter speeds to speeds you can generally handhold pretty reliably. So, or just 1/200th of a second, which you can definitely handhold reliably. This is all just a matter of comfort with how you use a flash. Built-in flash setting. So these are settings you can use for your flash mode. Built-in flash is custom wireless. These are for wireless and normal firing things. These have to do, if you are, I am not a Canon speedlight user, and these are going to apply to Canon speedlights. I am not the guy to tell you about what these different settings do. But I can tell you that in normal firing, you get different sets of controls with different options. We'll leave it in custom because we get the most control. Flash mode is ETTL2 or manual. What this means is ETTL2, your flash will automatically adjust the brightness that it puts forth based on the scene in front of it. With manual, you dial in all of the settings into your flash yourself, and your flash will do what you tell it to do, regardless of whether that's right or not. So manual is really good for studio settings or portrait shoots where you're taking a lot of identical photos over and over again. ETTL2 would be really good for things like event photography where you're at a party or a dance club taking photos of people. Shutter sync first curtain, we adjusted that in the second video. Wireless function here. These are Canon specific symbols and I do not recognize them. However, my best guess is that this wireless is off camera only. This is off camera and on camera set to the same settings, and this is off camera plus on camera with the different settings for them. That's my best guess, and if I'm wrong, somebody will leave a comment about that in the comments, I'm sure. Channel is your RF channel for wireless control. Flash exposure compensation allows you to overclock or underclock your flash manually. And this is your flash power ratio. We have this up here set to the ratio. So this, yes, that's right. So what this does is your off-camera to your on-camera flash power ratio. And this allows you to manually set, are they the same power? Is your off-camera twice as powerful as your on-camera? Or is your on-camera twice as powerful as your off-camera? And you can adjust that up to 8:1. External flash function settings. This menu cannot be displayed. It's incompatible with flash or flash power when flash power is turned off. Okay, let's see if I can get that. All right, I can't figure out how to get that menu to turn on, so apologize for that. External flash custom function setting. This, I believe, we can access in the custom functions menu. We'll see that later in the video if we can. And that is it for shooting menu 1. Shooting menu 2. We're going to start here with the exposure compensation and auto exposure bracketing menu. So if we use the left and right arrows, we can intentionally underexpose or intentionally overexpose our image. Now, if we use the command wheel, we can pull up the auto exposure bracketing guide right here. And now we can, here we go, intentionally, or we can set up auto bracketing. So auto bracketing will take a series of 3 shots, under, proper, and over. And that proper exposure is lined up here. So if we know that we have a setting and we want to take an HDR photo, we could do it this way. 3 raw photos spaced out pretty decently will give us a pretty good HDR. Or if we know that the subject is backlit and we want to have that subject be properly illuminated, but we don't know exactly which way to go, we can set up an auto bracket and one of the 3 photos will turn out. We can also bracket shift. So if I use the control pad buttons right here, with this auto bracketing, it will give me 2 shots that are very underexposed and 1 that is properly exposed. You can go the other way too. 1 that's properly exposed and 2 that are very exposed. We can go way over here to the side if we really want to shoot some very high key images, or over here if we really just want to shoot some very low key images. So this right here, what you're seeing right now, is for auto bracketing, and we can close that with the command wheel to bring it back to just exposure compensation. And right now, the way it's set, it will give you a proper exposure without anything over or underexposed intentionally. Auto lighting optimization is off, low, medium, and high. Generally recommend leaving this off. This is basically HDR light, and what it's going to do is control your lighting, but it's going to introduce some digital noise at the same time. If you shoot raw, all of this can be done with greater effectiveness in any modern photo editing software. Custom white balance allows you to create custom white balance. So this is using that custom white balance setting that we saw in the second video. What you would do is you would say, let's go back to that example we used of setting up a custom tabletop white softbox for product photography. You would take a photo of it and adjust the white balance settings until it looks white. Then you would use, you would adjust the white balance settings in your camera until that softbox looks white. Take a photo of it, and then you would use that photo to set your custom white balance so that every time you use that same setup in the future, you can use that custom white balance setting to control your white balance in that very specific environment to have consistent results. White balance shifting and bracketing. Bracketing allows you to shoot multiple shots with different white balance settings. So if we scroll the command dial this way, then we can take shots that are bracketed to the blue and the amber, or scroll it the other way to the green and the magenta. Using the cross pad, we can also manually shift the white balance around to achieve specific looks or compensate for lighting in a specific environment. Color space will give you two options, sRGB and Adobe RGB. S is standard. Unless you are very, very into the Adobe ecosystem, leave it on sRGB. sRGB can be understood by any software. Adobe RGB is a little bit more limited and not everything's going to recognize it. Picture style is neutral, so these are the same styles that we saw in the second video when we pulled up the picture style menu using this button right here. And again, you can select these if you want to. Just leaving it on neutral or faithful is going to be your best choice for the majority of shooting. Metering modes, here are your 4 metering modes. Okay, they are evaluative, partial, spot, and center weighted. Let's talk about what each of these do. Evaluative looks at the entire scene and it asks what's going on in the scene and what's the best shutter and aperture value to take the best picture. Partial is the very center of the scene, usually about 9.5% with Canon. That center part of the scene will be responsible for 100% of the exposure information. So a good use of partial metering is, let's say you're taking a photo of a person. You could take a meter reading with their face, either dial in the settings with the manual settings or use your auto exposure lock feature, which is the asterisk button right here. Hold those settings in place, compose your image, and take your photo. It also gives you the ability to look at a scene like a landscape or cityscape and select exactly what you want to have be the middle tone of your image, meter off of that, save those settings in the same way, and take your photo. Spot metering is the very, very center spot of your camera. Generally, it's either the center autofocus point or sometimes Canon, and I don't remember if it's the case with this camera, links your spot meter to your autofocus point. That might be one of the custom functions, I think. If it is, we'll get there. But this is an even smaller area of 100% of your metering information being provided than the partial. And center weighted averaging takes the center part of your image, an area about the size like this. That is responsible for about 60% of your metering information. Everything outside of that center area is responsible for about 40%. And so center weighted and evaluative are both pretty good for just general use photography if you're just going to be walking around and taking pictures of things. All right, shooting mode 3, shooting menu 3. Okay, dust delete data. What this does is this takes an image. You'll want to use a plain white background for it, and the camera will use that photo to find sensor dust. And then it will use algorithms to remove that sensor dust in subsequent photos. ISO Auto allows you to set the maximum ISO for your automatic ISO setting. So this only applies if you're using ISO Auto. Long exposure noise reduction and high ISO noise reduction have the same general function on different things. Long exposure, if you take a long exposure photo, then the camera will apply algorithms to reduce noise. For high ISO, if you're using a high ISO, and I forget the exact definition of that, probably 800 and higher, the camera will reduce noise. What I don't recall about this specific model is if it does it with a second photo or not. Some cameras do. At any rate, modern noise reduction software is much more powerful than what this camera brings to the table. So your best bet is just to leave these to off, shoot raw, and do any noise reduction that you need to in post. Aspect ratio is your image aspect ratio, so you can take different sized images on the same sensor. 3:2 uses the entire sensor, 4:3 is a slight crop, 16:9 is perfect if everything you're going to be doing is videos and you just want to not have to crop your 3:2 images down to 16:9 for things like frames that you're going to insert into video. And then 1:1 is square. Anti-flicker shooting is enable or disable. And what anti-flicker shooting does is prior to the shot being taken, the camera will scan the scene to see if there's artificial light in the scene, and if so, what its flickering rate is. And then it will take the photo at a time that is optimized to eliminating artificial light related flickering in the photos. This is something, if you're under full sun, you don't need to do this at all. This is only for artificial lighting. The other thing is that this can cause a delay between when you press the shutter button and the photo firing. It can also cause a delay between each shot in continuous drive mode. Live view shooting Live view shooting is enable or disable. In live view, do you want to be able to take a photo, yes or no? Autofocus method. There are 3 options: face tracking, FlexiZone, and FlexiZone autofocus, and FlexiZone autofocus. Different areas. So what face tracking does is it will recognize a face on the screen, and then it will track that face as it moves through the screen. If there are multiple faces, there is a way to select the face that you want to have tracked. This is the small area FlexiZone. Basically, what the camera will do is use a small area of autofocus points around the primary subject to track and predict focus and where the autofocus needs to go. And this is this is the zone. This is the single point right here. This will use the single autofocus point that is being tracked on the subject to predict its movement as it moves in the scene. So this is basically just a matter of personal preference on what types of things you're going to be shooting, which one of these you want to use. In general, FlexiZone AF with the slightly larger zone is going to be a more usable in more situations setting. Continuous autofocus is enable or disable. Do you want the autofocus to continue tracking whenever it needs to be tracking? In live view, that is. By the way, just remember all of these apply only to live view. Touchscreen, enable or disable. Do you want to be able to use a touchscreen when you're in live view? Grid display, enable or disable. Do you want to use a grid in live view? And if so, which one? Rule of thirds or the more complex grid? Totally a matter of personal preference here. Metering time. How long is the light meter going to stay on in live view? And again, just a matter of personal preference, how you're going to be using the camera and things like that. Playback menu 1. Protecting images allows you to protect either individual or all images on a card so that they can't accidentally be deleted. So you can do this by image, by folder, or by card. Rotating the images allows you to force the images to be rotated on the screen when you're looking at them. Erasing images allows you to erase images from the card. Print order lets you specify a print order. The thing with the print order is that you're controlling the printer through the camera. Generally, you're going to want to edit your photos a bit before they get printed, so I've never once in my life printed photos from a camera directly, except my cell phone, right? So this is something you're probably not ever going to use unless you have a Canon photo printer that you are printing directly to from your camera. Photo book setup lets you set up a photo book. This is not something I've ever done, so I'm not going to be the guy to tell you how to use it. Creative filters are filters you can apply to your photos. Honestly, there's probably a better selection of this with a number of free softwares online right now. There's really no reason to use this in your camera. Resize lets you resize images. This is another thing that there's just not a whole lot of reason to do it in your camera. Memory cards right now are pretty inexpensive. Even this one, which has a 32 gig in it, can hold almost 1,000 photos, and I'm pretty sure there's some other stuff on that card. It's not like back in the day when a 2 gig memory card was, going to make it hard to store all your files on it for a single shoot. Playback 2. Cropping allows you to crop images. Rating allows you to rate images so that you can sort them if you want to, but you'd have to go through all of your different images and select ratings for them. A little bit of a pain to do on a camera. Slideshow allows you to start a slideshow so you could show people the photos you took of the day. This will also work if you are connecting your camera to a TV display, for instance. Image jump with your command wheel on the top here. If you want to skip through your photos, you can either skip through 1, 10, 100, and by the time of day, the folder, just to the movies, skip just to movies, or skip just to photos, or just ones that you've rated well with the command wheel. Just a matter of personal preference for this and how you use your playback. Autofocus point display displays on your playback the autofocus point that was used in your image. Histogram display displays the histogram, either brightness or red, green, blue, when you play back your image. And control over HDMI is how the camera plays back through your slideshow to a TV when it's connected via HDMI. I've never once connected a camera directly to a TV via any method, let alone an HDMI cable. I'm not going to be the guy to tell you exactly how this works. Okay, Settings Menu 1. Select Folder. This allows you to select the folder that you want to have your photos stored in, or you can create a new one. So for instance, if you have 2 shoots in a day, you could create a folder for shoot 1 and a folder for shoot 2, and then it would be very easy to separate them when you get back to your computer and want to know which files are from which shoot. File numbering is continuous, auto reset, or manual reset. Continuous just goes 1 to 9999 and then resets. Auto reset will reset at some predetermined thing. I forget if it's daily or monthly or what triggers the automatic reset. Manual reset will allow you to manually force reset your file numbering right now to 1. On all my cameras, I tend to just leave this on continuous because the number changes, right? But if I were to take if I had the numbers automatically resetting and I started moving identically named files into the same folder, it could risk overwriting files that I've already worked on or that I want to keep separately. Or it could make me think that I have moved files from my camera when I haven't, and I could accidentally delete work before I ever see it. So as a general rule, I recommend just leaving this on continuous because that gives you 10,000 files before you have to worry about numbering being the same. Auto rotate on your camera or your computer is on, only computer is on, and off. And this has to do with when you do playback, either on your computer or your camera. Formatting the card erases everything on your SD card. Wi-Fi and NFC, you can enable or disable them. This is something that will allow you to wirelessly transfer photos to your smartphone or your computer, for instance. If you enable it, now Wi-Fi function, we can transfer images to between cameras, camera to phone, camera to printer, camera to web service, camera to computer. Settings Menu 2, Auto Power Off, is how long the camera will wait to power off without anything being done to it automatically. This is just a matter of battery preservation and how much you use your camera. I usually set that to 15 minutes. Don't know why that was disabled. LCD brightness is how bright you want your LCD screen to be. Are you shooting outside under full sun or inside in a dark museum? LCD on-off button, shutter and display, shutter button only or remain on. This is, do you want your shutter button only to turn your LCD screen on and off? Shutter button only means when you half press your shutter button, the LCD screen will turn off. When you release it, it'll turn back on. Shutter button and display, you can turn the screen on by pushing the display button. Remains on, the screen will always be on. This is just a matter of personal preference and battery preservation and how you use your camera. Date and time zone allows you to adjust the date, your time zone, so on and so forth. Language is the language that you want to use your camera in. Viewfinder display will allow you to have in your optical viewfinder a grid display. You can either show it or hide it. This is what it will look like when you look through your viewfinder. Flicker detection, either showing or hiding. Is there going to be flickering from artificial light sources, and it will tell you with a warning in your viewfinder if there is. GPS device settings. If you have a GPS device, which I do not for this camera, you can connect it and then control the settings through here. Not having a GPS, it won't let me do anything. Settings Menu 3. Screen color is what color you would like you to look at when you turn the camera on. Red right here, if you're doing astrophotography or overnight photography, is a really good one because it will cause your eyes to dilate less, which means you won't lose your dark sight when you're out at night. But the other 4, just a matter of personal preference and how easy it is for you to read the information when you look at that screen. Feature guide, enable or disable. This is basically a help menu that pops up for different features when you are going to use them. Touch control, standard, sensitive, or disable. How sensitive do you want the LCD touchscreen to be? Battery information. Model of battery, LPE17. Remaining capacity, it's fully charged. Rechargeable performance, it can hold up to a maximum charge. So this screen will tell you how good or old your battery is. Is your battery starting to develop a memory? Do you need to buy a new one? Things like that. Sensor cleaning, Auto cleaning is enabled or disabled. This will allow the camera to clean the sensor automatically, and we'll see that in just a second. So auto cleaning, when you enable it, allows the camera to clean the sensor automatically every time that it starts up and turns off, and that's a good way to help keep dust off of your sensor. Cleaning now forces the camera to clean the sensor right now if you want to do that. And cleaning manually will force the shutter open and the mirror up so that you can access the sensor with a dust brush to clean it. Video system is NTSC or PAL based on where you live. And settings 4. Certification logo display displays the certifications. Custom functions we're going to get to at the end of this video, and there are 13 of them, and they do some additional controls over how your camera operates. Copyright information allows you to enter something like your name into the photo's EXIF data so that you can document that you have copyright of an image, and that can make it a little bit easier either to prove that someone has stolen your image or to keep track of which photographer has taken photos. Especially if you are looking at this and you have 5 different people who will be taking photos for you, you can enter their name into each of these different settings, make sure they have the correct camera, and then you can keep track of who's taking what photos. Clear settings erases either just the settings, all of the settings rather, everything, the whole kit and caboodle that we've looked at, or just the custom functions. I'm going to back out of that carefully. And then the firmware version displays what version of the firmware you have. Version 1.1.0 is the current version of the firmware. I have to assume that's probably also the last version of the firmware given this camera's age. It was still available to install on this camera as of yesterday when I did it. This camera, when I picked it up, came with version 1.0.0. So installing the firmware is very easy. You just put it on the root drive of your SD card, turn on the camera in program mode, come to this menu, go into the firmware version, and then tell it to update, and it does, and it takes a few minutes. The camera will only update if you have a fully charged battery. My menu settings, this is a menu you can set up with the functions that you use most often. So we're going to go in here, and you can register something to My Menu. So all you have to do is find the option in here that you're going to use often. I want to change aspect ratios often. So I'm going to register it to My Menu, and now aspect ratios is at the top of My Menu. Okay, let's register something else. Image quality. Now, aspect ratio and image quality are added to My Menu. But you know what? I really want image quality up at the top. So you can come into Sort, select the item, hit Set, and then you can drag it around to where you want it, hit Set, and you've rearranged your menu to what you want to have be at the top. So the things that you use the most that you can't access with buttons on the camera should definitely be at the top. Delete item or items will allow you to delete one or more things from your My Menu if you find that you're not using them very often. Delete all items will let you clear out all of the items from My Menu if you decide you want to completely redo it, or you sell the camera and don't want someone else to know what you had on there. And display from My Menu, if you enable this, whenever you hit the menu button, it will go straight to My Menu. And that can save you a lot of time if you're a power user of My Menu and who has put some things in there that you find very useful. So that's everything in the menus. Let's go back to custom functions. We're going to go through all 13 of these, explain what they are and what they do. Custom function, here we go. 1, exposure. This is your EV stops. Do you want to have your exposure value, your aperture and your shutter speed, displayed in 1/3 or 1/2 EV? This is basically, if you're shooting in RAW, it does not matter. RAW gives you so much editing forgiveness that this just becomes a matter of how much time do I want to spend scrolling between apertures and shutter speeds on my camera. So it's just a matter of personal preference. If you're shooting JPEG, this can matter a little bit more, but realistically you should just be shooting RAW and editing in RAW, and who cares what this setting is at that point. This is ISO expansion off or on. With ISO expansion, it allows higher ISOs to be accessed with your ISO setting. And this is generally just a personal preference. Now, with a camera like this, if you enable it, you're going to get access to either, I think it's 25-600 is the new top ISO that it will give you. That's not something you're going to shoot with on a matter of, a day-to-day basis. That's something you would use if you're trying to compose a scene at night or in the dark, and you don't want to do a 30-second exposure just to see how far off your tripod is. So that's something you can use as a compositional aid, high ISO. So if you're somebody who shoots a lot of night scenes, that can actually be something very beneficial to you. Highlight tone priority. Basically what this does is this helps prevent your highlights from being blown out, but it does sacrifice some of the shadow quality in your images. When this is enabled, it adjusts your ISO range to 200 through 12,800. You lose access to 100 ISO with this setting. In video, it caps your ISO at 6400, by the way. And basically, this just adjusts camera settings so that you're not getting things like completely blown out skies if you're photographing somebody underneath an awning. Matter of personal preference in the way that you use your camera. If you're shooting RAW, there's not a whole lot that this setting is going to do for you that you can't already do with RAW editing. Custom function 3, autofocus and drive. This is autofocus assist beam firing. Enable or disable, enable, disable, enable external flash only, or IR AF assist beam only. So enable will allow the light that's on the front of your camera to work as an autofocus assist beam. Disable will always turn it off. So if you're going to be at a place that's very sensitive for lighting, such as a play, you can disable that here. Enable only with an external flash. Some Canon speedlight flashes have an autofocus assist beam built into them. If you're going to use one of those in a dark space, you can enable only that flash to use the autofocus assist beam, and the camera can do that. This will use only infrared from an appropriate Canon flash for autofocus assist. So if you have a Canon speedlight with an infrared AF assist beam feature, you can use that with this camera here, and now no one will ever know if you're using an autofocus assist light. Autofocused area selection method, 0 and 1. So in the area selection method, you have two options. You can either use the autofocus button on the outside of the camera with 0, or you can use the main dial, which is the command wheel on the top of the camera here, to scroll through autofocus points. It's just a matter of personal preference and how often you think you're going to be using autofocus point selection changes. I tend just to leave this in 0 because I don't change autofocus points all that often. Autofocus point set color tracking, one-shot auto AF or disable. Okay, so one-shot autofocus, automatic autofocus point selection color tracking. What this does is if you have 0, one-shot autofocus only will, I believe that the way that this works is it hones in on human skin tones and tracks those with autofocus, or you can disable it, which causes the autofocus just to work normally and look for high contrast areas. Autofocus point display during focus. So there are 4 options here. No, there's more than 4. There's 5. 0 through 4. Okay. With autofocus display during focus, this shows the selected, not necessarily the active, autofocus points. And what this means is that selected gives you the selected autofocus points in black in your viewfinder and maybe also live view. And so if you select this, you can always see in your display as you're composing your image which autofocus points would potentially be used for that image. That can be a really useful guide if you're using a single autofocus point or an autofocus point zone. This is only the selected autofocus points that you would use. All autofocus points, regardless of whether or not you've selected single point or zone autofocus points, will always be shown in the display. Selected autofocus points prior to autofocus that are in focus will be shown. Selected in focus autofocus points will be shown, and display if you want to have a slightly disable if you want to have a slightly cleaner display. Matter of personal preference and what information you want to see in your viewfinder. Viewfinder display illumination, auto enable or disable. And this shows your active autofocus points, whether or not in red. So if you have 3 autofocus points that are going to be used, then when you have it enabled, it will show those to you in your viewfinder. Disabled will never show them. Auto will show them when the camera thinks you need to know that information. Mirror lockup, disable or enable. Mirror lockup is a function that locks up the mirror in the reflex housing prior to taking a photo. When you push the shutter button the first time, the mirror locks up. When you push it a second time or use a remote control, then the photo is taken. Only use this if you have a tripod and you need MLU for something like a star trails photo or a macro photo or something like that, where you want to ensure you eliminate as much potential shake from the camera as possible prior to taking your photo. 10. Absolutely my least favorite custom function in Canon cameras. This is your shutter auto exposure lock button function, and there are 4 of these: 0, 1, 2, and 3. With 0, autofocus and AE lock. What this does is the exposure locks when the focus locks, which is fine most of the time, but can be a problem when you have moving subjects that run into an area of either brighter or darker lighting. 1 is auto exposure lock and autofocus follows. One is auto exposure lock with autofocus, and this allows metering and focusing to be done separately. With this, the asterisk button right here does the focusing. Half pressing the shutter locks the automatic exposure settings. 2 is autofocus lock with no auto exposure lock. This works only in autofocus auto intelligent AI servo mode when the asterisk pauses autofocus operation. And while the asterisk is pressed, this prevents autofocus from being messed up by an object passing between you and the subject and the camera. So for instance, this can be useful at something like a race car event when you're in the grandstands and there's a lamp post between you and the track that could potentially throw off your autofocus when you pan past it while you're taking photos of the car. And 3, auto exposure, autofocus. There is no auto exposure lock, and this is useful for subjects that keep moving and stopping repeatedly, especially in places where lighting is changing often, like at a park, for instance, and there's trees or playground equipment that's casting shadows. And this is good for that situation because it will lock focus, but exposure will not be locked until the image is taken. So what I would recommend for this, my best tip, is to pick one of these 4 and just stick with it and get used to how it works. 0 is the standard. That's the way that most autofocus and auto exposure lock systems work on most cameras. It's the one I use on all of the cameras I shoot with, but it's a matter of your personal preference, how you plan to use the camera and what settings you plan to shoot in. Custom function 11 assigns a function to the set button. So normal is disabled. The set function only works to set functions when you are using them in the menu system. And then you have this other list of things you could assign it to do. Bring up the image quality menu, bring up the flash exposure compensation menu, the LCD monitor on-off function, display the menu, display your ISO speed, and display the flash function settings. Now of these, the LCD screen on or off, menu display, and ISO are duplicate functions of other buttons on the camera. So there's really no reason to assign those to the set button. If you wanted to assign the image quality, the flash EV settings, or the flash functions to it, you could do that and give yourself a little bit of extra usability from this camera. LCD display when powered on is either display on or previous display setting. When you turn the camera on with display on, the LCD will turn on. And that's just a good way for you to confirm that your camera's working and powered on because the screen turns on. previous display setting, if the LCD was off when you turned off the camera, it will be off when you turn it back on, and vice versa. If it was on when you turned off the camera, then it will be on when you turn it back on. I like my cameras to perform consistently, so I leave that to display on whenever the camera is turned on. Retract lens on power off, enable, or disable. When you turn off the camera, do you want the lens to be zoomed back to infinity focus or not? I think that's something that every camera maker should do. Sony Minolta started doing it back in the 90s with their Alpha cameras. They were, as far as I know, the first ones to do that. It's just a nice feature. I really like leaving that enabled. And that is it. That is everything in the entire menu system for the Canon EOS Rebel T6i. And I hope that those explanations kind of helped explain how those different settings adjust and affect your photography so that you know what settings you want to use with your camera to get the most out of it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next camera manual video. Thank you everyone for watching. If this video was helpful and useful to you, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track and that I'm producing and creating content which is helpful to you. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about responding every couple of days and answering whatever questions you have to the best of my ability. If you'd like to subscribe to find out when I have more videos about how to use cameras, photographic techniques, or the best practices for the tools of the trade, by all means please subscribe and check that notifications bell to be alerted when new content arrives. If you'd like to support the channel by joining with a membership, there are now membership options for this channel at different tiers that will give you different benefits if you would be interested in that. And one last thing, thank you everyone very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next videos. Won't we, Steinbeck? What's that look about?